Dear panelists, honorable co-chairs, excellencies, Hilde Schwab, ladies and gentlemen. It's my honor and pleasure to welcome you to our 27th World Economic Forum on Africa. And it's again an amazing turnout. We do have more than 1,000 participants over the course of the next 2 days from different countries, hundreds among them. And we do have certainly not only a global community, but a very diverse community, truly a multi-stakeholder community. We have heads of state, heads of government, around 7. We have more than 100 ministers and heads of international organizations, 700 business leaders, and 250 out of them are from the African continent. We have the NGOs, the academics, social entrepreneurs, and the next generation, the youth, represented by our young global leaders and shapers community. And we are very proud to have 277 women leaders here at our summit. And yes, we are a very diverse community, but we have one thing in common. We are all committed to improving the state of Africa. That's the reason why we're here for the next 2 days. But there's another purpose of this meeting. Yes, we are here to shape Africa's agenda. But at the same time, the time is more than ripe to raise Africa's voice on a global level, to bring in Africa's point of view in all the ongoing global discussions, in the system initiatives, in the UN SDGs. So it's on you to contribute to both purpose of this summit, bringing the people from outside to Africa and bringing Africa to the rest of the world in the era of the fourth industrial revolution in a disrupted world. And on that note, it's my honor and pleasure to hand over to our today's moderator, Wim Bai. Wim Bai, thank you for moderating, and now the floor is yours. The World Economic Forum on Africa 2017 is now officially opened. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, and welcome everybody to the first plenary session of the World Economic Forum on Africa. I'm excited to have you guys all here today. This panel is about leadership in the age of disruption. I'm Wimbai Kajese, former anchor turned tech entrepreneur and proudly Zimbabwean, and also a YGL within the World Economic Forum. And to my left, I have here Winnie Byanyima. And she has a long list of accomplishments which I cannot go through, but she's currently head of the executive director of Oxfam International. We also have here Rich Lesser, who is this global CEO of BCG, and he hails from New York. And we also have Tony Elumelu, who is the chairman of UBA and also runs a foundation that bears his name as well. And we also have Lindiwe Mazibuko, who is a former head of the South African opposition in the DA and former parliamentarian. Right. Thank you. So how we're going to do this is I'm going to ask you guys each a question, and then one of you are free to respond. You're more than welcome to respond, and then I'm going to ask you a few general questions afterwards. So I'm going to start with you, Winnie. Given the context that we find ourselves in this global environment, you could say there's a lot of discontent marked by the uprising of popularism, seen by the Trump win, Brexit, etc. And then when we come here to the continent, we're seeing that certain incumbent governments have been dislodged. So my question to you, in the context of responsive and responsible leadership, when it comes to climate change, it has been a bit of a blind spot in the African discourse, right? And one could say it is even a Western narrative. Yet it is our African countries, it is our people, and it is especially our women that suffer from its effects, particularly in agriculture. Please, can you speak to that?
Well, first, we're talking about leadership, and we're talking about disruption, by the way. Disruption is necessary for progress. But when I was receiving the invitation and I saw a connection between civil unrest, terrorism, populism. We have to distinguish things here. Terrorism is about crime, killing people and all that, but civil unrest is the legitimate response of people to what they perceive as an unfair political and economic system. That is what I want to focus on.
Okay.
That people are criticizing leadership right here in South Africa. They are criticizing leadership. And you know, Oxfam has done a study and found that 3 billionaires in this country own as much wealth as the bottom half of the population, 28 million. That's unfairness. People are complaining about. In Africa, 4 out of 5 most unequal countries in the world are right here in this continent. Swaziland topping, then Nigeria, then Namibia, then South Africa, among the 5 most unequal countries in the world. And what does that really mean? That ordinary people are trapped in poverty, that the figures of growth in the past have just been about a few people making more and more profits and others remaining outside this show of success. So people have justified legitimate reasons to protest, and the response of governments to silence them, to reduce the space for engagement, freedom of association, freedom of assembly. Last year, Civicus did a study, and they found that in Africa, only 2 countries can be described as open societies. Only 2, Cape Verde, Sao Tome and Principe. And 8 others were described as closed societies. Those are mostly conflict countries, and the rest were somewhere in the middle, partially open. And the trend is to silence workers, silence women, silence youth, because they are protesting about unfairness, about rising economic inequality, and people being, youth of Africa, 70% of the working youth in Africa are described as working in poverty. They are living in poverty. They're trapped in poverty, but they are working, of those working. So you want to talk about climate change? Yes, we can talk about that. It's real. It is happening. The droughts, the frequent floods are connected with a changing climate, and it's hurting, and you're right to say, the people most hurt are those who live off the land, natural resources, poor people. They are being hurt, they are paying the price of those at the top of the lifestyles of those who are very rich. So again, it's about unfairness, that those who pick up the tab of climate change are those who didn't cause it in the first place. So it's about unfairness, and it's about people's legitimate voicing of this unfairness, and we need to have leaders who listen and who respond.
Yes. So I would like to say that leaders have responded. The response has been swift in silencing, but has it been responsible?
No,
and
not
how
at
can
all.
it be more responsible?
Not from governments and not from business. I'll tell you what we want from governments.
Sure.
If governments, African governments are listening, they should be investing first and foremost in agriculture, where most of our people are and where the people are dying because agriculture has died, because there's a changing climate that's forcing them to live in adverse weather conditions with no insurance to shocks and no way of adapting. African governments are pushing for big business, big agribusiness. Fine, it can also create a few jobs, but it won't touch the lives of small-scale farmers. So we want to see more investments in irrigation systems, road networks, technology, finance, credit, security on land. These things aren't happening, these investments and if they happen, they would raise growth.
Yes.
Actually, investment in agriculture can reduce poverty 5 times more than in any other economic sector. but they're not doing it. They are making pledges at the African Union. They don't live up to them. So that's our African leadership that I come here to speak forcefully to, with the anger, the pain, and the urgency. 3 famines in Africa today.
Yes.
3. It's a shame on our leadership. We should be embarrassed, and I include myself and our political leaders, that 3 continents, 3 countries, including rich Nigeria, there's famine. There's famine. Famine is a sign of failure, because even if there's drought, you can predict, you can see it coming, you can plan for it, you can put resources there, you can stop people from dying, but they are dying. So it's a sign of failure of leadership on our part.
Do any of the panelists want to respond to that?
Oh, sorry. I didn't hear. First is, Winnie, I admire the passion that she brings to the conversations. I also like this topic we're discussing today, but I want to provoke the brain a little bit.
Please be very provocative.
If I were an African political leader, I'll speak for the private sector soon, and you bring the issue of climate change to me, I will redefine the agenda. I will deal with some other issues. I think that the agenda for African leaders at this point in time should be how to alleviate poverty. There's so much poverty in Africa. Climate change is important to the world and to Africa, but who is setting the agenda for Africa and for African leaders? We have difficulties in people feeding, as Winnie said. Poverty is an issue, and how do we deal with eradicate poverty on the continent? I believe strongly, and when we talked about intervention by business leaders, that there are things that must be done in concert, private sector and public sector together. Access to electricity in Africa is very, very poor. And if we go with the current narrative on climate change, carbon emission in Africa is less than 2% compared to America and other places where you have 17.7%. So in dealing with the issue of energy poverty in Africa, poor access to electricity, which we need to tackle if we must alleviate poverty on the continent, I will, to some extent, set that aside and deal with the issue of poverty, issue of entrepreneurship, issue of enabling business environment, issues that affect rural-urban migration, why people leave the rural area and move to the urban center, why food security has remained a problem now. It's not a problem for us in Africa. I speak also as somebody who has intervened in this area. I have the Tony Elumelu Foundation, a foundation we set up to support African entrepreneurs. We realized that agriculture is key. And for 3 years running, we have supported about 300 African agri entrepreneurs every year, and that should be about 900 of them by now. That, to me, is a practical demonstration of business sector intervention in dealing with this issue that's important. But for these entrepreneurs to succeed, our government must come in, and I agree with Winnie. We'll go to AU, we make declarations, and not much is done beyond there. We also come to WEF, and we talk, and at the end of the day, not much. And so seeing this, a platform that brings public and private sector leaders together, in Africa, let us use this opportunity to call on our political leaders across the continent, no exceptions, to help to improve the business environment. If we improve the business environment, we will be able to deal with the issue of poverty, entrepreneurs, because indeed, as we said, the people who grow economies are SMEs, entrepreneurs. And big businesses we do try, but to a large extent don't really create employment and all the issues we suffer. And what entrepreneurs need to succeed is that the business environment will be right. These entrepreneurs we are supporting, some of them have serious difficulties and challenges because the operating environment is stifling. They have to provide their own water, they have to provide their own transportation, they have to provide their own electricity. How would they succeed? And if they don't succeed, it becomes a vicious cycle. And so for Africa, as an African leader, the agenda and the narrative should change. We should talk about poverty alleviation that will bring employment, poverty alleviation that will help our young ones to be meaningfully engaged so that issues of terrorism and co is tackled with. And most importantly, we need to put electricity in homes in Africa. Those are, in my viewpoint, what we should be talking about as Africans. Thank you.
Definitely. Rich, do you have something to say?
Sure, I'd like to pick up on the themes that Winnie and Tony have raised, and sort of, I mean, the continent has made quite good progress over the last 10 or 15 years, but there are enormous challenges ahead. And I think when we think about the agenda here, to keep it simple, I would say AEIOU, 5 things. The first is agriculture, what Winnie described. We have a huge challenge. The population's growing here dramatically. At the exact same time, there's more and more strain on the system, partly from climate change and partly from other factors as well. We were at COP22 early in the year, and there's a huge need to take on adaptation in African agriculture in response to what's happening in climate change. The world, for all the resources put into climate change, there's less focus on adaptation than there needs to be, and there's much less focus on Africa, given its share of the population and the strain. So agriculture is number 1. Education is number 2. One-tenth the number of tertiary school attendees here in Africa. 61 million people, or young people, are estimated not to get primary school education. There's 1/10 the number of scientists that there should be relative to the frequency in the rest of the world. And it is the single biggest lever to lift people out of poverty anywhere in the world, not just here in Africa, but the gap here in Africa is huge, and we need to have leadership that's incredibly focused on improving the quality of teachers, the investment in the education system, and frankly, leveraging digital technologies which can not solve the problem, but can help. The third is infrastructure. The comments that Tony was just making: power, roads, transport, air. There's a massive underinvestment, $360 billion or so in infrastructure to support the growth in the continent. The fourth is opportunity. We need to recognize that big businesses alone are not going to provide the jobs for so many young people coming in the market. We need to support entrepreneurialism, but we also need to recognize the importance of financial inclusion and the importance of helping everyone get an opportunity to make a difference by being connected to the internet, having access to the connectivity that comes with our digital world. And then finally is understanding. We need a leadership that is more, and that's not, by the way, just an Africa issue. You started by talking about forces of populism around the world. Around the world, people are feeling out of touch and disconnected with leadership. We see it in the discussions that are happening in France right now. And so, but here in Africa, with so many young people, with so many strains on the system, the challenge for leadership to be empathetic, to realize we live in a multi-stakeholder world, to show true understanding of the situation of others, and to look for ways to make a positive difference that contributes to the community are particularly important. Not alone, but particularly important. So agriculture, education, infrastructure, opportunity, understanding, to me would be the way I would sort of describe the leadership challenge right now.
Okay, and I just want to ask Lindiwe a question to build up on what Rich has said. He talked about leaders needing to be more empathetic, and I would add to that having trust, because once you lose trust, where do you go as a population when you cannot, when you don't believe that your leaders will deliver? Yeah. So my question to you, as somebody that has been in the line of the political fire, is what are the things that African leaders can do to better manage their capabilities as responsive leaders in the future?
I mean, I think when we talk about responsive and responsible leadership on the continent specifically, that we have a tendency to ask the wrong questions. Mm-hmm. Every discussion we've had here about policy, whether it's the effects of climate change, extremism, civil protest, ignores the underpinning problem, which is that Africa has a leadership vacuum. That there are a slew of leaders on the continent who have had generations to implement the kind of change that would mean that in 2045, when the youth population doubles, there would be economic opportunities, democratic institutions in place, and no need for the kinds of disruptions and the kinds of desperation that is shown by people who take to the streets or young people who join extremist movements so that they can have food in their belly at the end of the night. We are ignoring the fact that the current crop of Africa's leaders, in large part, has failed to deliver on a lot of these outcomes. Yet we're asking what these same leaders can do to make it better. And my conviction is that we're asking the wrong people, and we're not making enough of an effort to think about who is going to replace the current crop of failed leaders into the future in order to solve these problems, which in many cases were preventable, foreseeable. For example, the decline in commodities prices. Commodities prices are cyclical, yet the decline in commodities prices is exposing the lack of quality skills and education to prepare young people for the workplace, and demonstrating that we haven't built diversified economies that can support our people and that can give young people real futures. These things are foreseeable. There's nowhere on earth where there hasn't been an oil crisis or a price crisis. So there are many things. Climate change is another. The response to climate change, the response to the demographic bulge. All of these are leadership challenges that should have been responded to by our current crop of leaders, and they haven't been. And so we should not be asking that same crop of leaders to have another opportunity to make more mistakes. We should be asking what we're going to do to cultivate, inculcate, and build a new cohort of leaders. And of course, there are exceptions. There are people on the continent, in my country and your countries, who've done incredible work, who've brought opportunities for, small groups of people, marginalized people in certain parts of our society. But on the whole, there's been a leadership failure on the continent that we don't talk enough about. So, in addition to these policy challenges that we address, the disruptions that are affecting the continent, how much time are we going to spend over the next 2-3 days talking about what we as existing, former, current leaders in Africa are going to do to build a new generation, a new cohort that is more responsive, more empathetic, and more nimble and able to deal with the challenges of today.
Just to build up on what you've said, this is an open question for all of you. One of the ways that we talk about disrupting leadership is through how we educate. And so my question to you is, given the way that we traditionally educate ourselves, one could say that a university degree will be obsolete in a few years. We have education entrepreneurs on this continent that are redefining and reforming how to groom our leaders. Do you agree that Africa has an opportunity in this area?
You raise an important question, and I think Lindiwe put it, I like the way Lindiwe put it, that we have a crop of leaders who have failed, and we should be building new leadership. Well, I would agree and also not agree. I think, one, it's important to build leaders, to build young people, to be leaders in the future, to be leaders now and leaders in the future, but it's also important, of course, to hold the current crop of leaders accountable, because they are either elected or appointed, and also because they hold power if they are in business, so we have to hold them accountable. But in the question of growing leadership, I worry, because African governments are moving backwards. They are not moving in the right direction. Rich has just reminded us that 61 children are not in school. The highest number of children not going to school is in this continent, who are not achieving primary education. What we are seeing now are governments going back on the objective of universal primary education, universal secondary education, and going back to privatizing it, taking it out of the reach of poor children, particularly girls. We have to resist this. This is failure. And why are they doing this? Because they don't collect enough revenue. They don't have enough revenue to roll out universal secondary education, universal primary education. Now, instead of looking for ways to maximize revenue, which include closing tax loopholes that companies use to hide away their profits, resisting harmful tax competition. You know, in the last 30 years, this continent has seen an increased use of tax holidays and tax incentives. It's now become normal, but it wasn't always like that. But it's because companies have pushed down governments. We found that I think this is a study by, I can't remember who, but in 2012, 4 countries in this region, Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda, lost $2.8 billion through tax incentives. Kenya loses $1 billion in tax incentives every year. That's money for education of our children and health. Instead of collecting that, they are rolling out privatizing of education. So we want to see progressive taxation, strong tax systems that rein in the resources that are being hemorrhaged, and resisting tax competition, so that there are enough resources, so that education can be free for the future. These young people, the jobs that they are going to do in future are not even yet created. So we need to think about a very modern, futuristic education for our children if we're going to have a chance in the world that is coming.
And what does that education look like? Because currently, we've been educated to serve our former colonial masters, and we've been educated to basically be middlemen and women to negotiate deals that we can't build ourselves. So what does that education look like to build the future of Africa so that we can be agile and responsive leaders?
You know, when I think about the education deficit, you know, I think about it in terms of the overeducated young people on the continent who have degrees that are no longer serving the knowledge economy. But I also think about the unskilled young people on the continent whom many policymakers in Africa are expecting to be able to benefit from a wave of unskilled work that's going to come from East Asia. But that wave is destined not to come if mechanization and artificial intelligence take over first. So
Sure.
There is a danger that we're going to have a vacuum in terms of employment opportunities for unskilled people. So at both ends of the economy, both the skilled and the unskilled end, there is a danger looming that we haven't future-proofed our continent for effectively enough, of unemployed, and I hate this word because it is so hopeless, but unemployable young people who have not been equipped for the future, for which their policymakers were not prepared, did not understand enough about, did not care enough about, because they were busy with other things. So, I mean, I hope when we talk about education, we bundle that word with skills development, because I think when we talk about education, we still think in the traditional mold. We don't think about things like coding. We don't think about, entrepreneurialism. We don't think about skills development, and we don't think about opportunities for people to gain skills in the workplace. We think about, primary education, secondary education, tertiary education. And that is the old mold of skills development. So, as we think about the future, are we cultivating, building, and encouraging leaders on the continent to think about these challenges into the future? Or are we just waiting for a wave of devastation and unemployment to break on the shores of our continent when those jobs fail to arrive from East Asia?
Rich, would you like to respond?
I just have to say I'm a bit more hopeful about the continent and the progress that's been made in terms of growth and giving opportunity. And that's not to minimize all the challenges that have been described. But I would come back to this education point as the single biggest one. And in answer to your question, I think we're trying to do 3 things right now. One is get all of our young people to a basic set of skills, a basic ability to function in society, to be contributing members, to go through a primary and secondary education. And that's a big gap today, and that's the starting point. I think the second is to recognize that STEM skills are more and more fundamental in today's world, and there's a huge gap around the world. I'm in a lot of conversations in the US, and the whole conversation is how do we get more students into STEM education and support them, not necessarily even college degrees, even a year or 2 after high school, but just some level of ability to function in a world where the interface of man and machine and the ability to connect to our digital world, automation, will be more and more important. And then the third is to recognize the rate of change that's upon us, and I mean all of us, not just here, is more than we've ever experienced in human history. For thousands of years, or as long as humans have been, you learned a basic skill early in your life, in your first 10 to 20 years, depending on what generation you grew up, and you did that. You were an agriculture worker, then you were eventually a factory worker in the more recent last couple centuries, and you had that skill and you did it for most of your life. We're watching changes, every 5 years that are really substantial, and that the skills that you learn at one time will work for a while, but they won't work forever. So part of our education system needs to evolve to not just teaching rote knowledge to learn a skill that can be employed for decades, but teaching our children how to learn and how to be lifelong learners so that they can be adaptive to a world where there will be change around them, change here, change everywhere else. And that's, in some ways, that's the hardest challenge. It's easy to say, well, just teach them science instead of something else. It's harder to say, how do we get them to do that? And I think there's a whole set of different education techniques and philosophies and digital leveraging technology can help to do that. But step one, a basic education for every child has got to be the starting point.
And you see, and that's, I don't share the optimism of Rich, unfortunately, because I'm seeing the trend here. We are not getting that commitment to give every child that basic education you've talked about. The primary education and the secondary education, that's qualitative, where a child sits in a classroom, is taught by a trained teacher, and learns those basic skills of understanding, skills of learning, knowing how to learn, knowing how to be analytical, those basic skills. They are not getting them. What are we getting? We are getting governments handing over their responsibility to educate their children to private operators. And what are they doing? You get companies that come with a little laptop, and they hire unqualified teachers. They insist on not following the education rules, the curriculum and all that, and they just teach them how to play on a laptop, and they call that an education. That's not. That's low cost, low quality education. That's a dead end route for our children. And that's where we're heading. So we need to get governments to commit once again to investing in our children and giving them the basics that they need to be adults in a world that will have changed so much. We're not going there.
Tony, are you as pessimistic as Winnie? You upskill a lot of young people. What are some of your success stories?
Okay, before I go into the success story, I think, so we have these sessions of 45 minutes. We spent about 30 minutes of this session, in my viewpoint, kind of conducting literature review. This about leadership in Africa, my understanding is we should be discussing how to further engage our government to help develop this continent. Education is one, good governance is one, accountability is three. But all of this is for the betterment of our people, good living for our people, inclusive growth for our people. The greatest challenge as a continent that we face, to me, is how we put jobs on the market for the Africans who are going to be entering the job markets. If we don't fix this, one day we'll come back here and be talking again about the consequences of joblessness in Africa. I see in the faces and eyes of the entrepreneurs that we support, the young African, you go, okay, so there's this supply side conversation at times. We have young Africans who are even educated, no jobs. And it is even becoming a disincentive for some in their community to even aspire to be educated. When I was going to school, you saw a graduate got a job. That on its own was an incentive for even your parents to struggle to send you to school. But that is gone. So I want, from a pragmatic point of view, hoping that African leaders are listening to this conversation and that the communique is presented to them. we must deal with issue of inclusive growth. And you can't talk about that without jobs. And we must channel our resources, efforts towards making this possible. That is what my foundation, Elumelu Foundation, will try to do in our own little way, to support 1,000 African entrepreneurs every year, realizing that if these entrepreneurs succeed, the multiplier effect is huge. In their communities, others will be encouraged to do more, to also want to succeed. They will help to create jobs. That is how, in the 21st century, we can help the African economy take off. Let me use this opportunity also to make a call. You know, at times, you see development partners and the world. They feel that support should go to African countries that are well-governed, and that those that are not well-governed don't give support to them. And I think the world should begin to rethink this approach, because we might end up, you see, bad leaders, it will be good for bad leaders. If you don't intervene and focus on those countries, bad leaders will continue to perpetuate themselves in office. So we need to begin to rethink that approach to say maybe those are even the countries that the global community should support more, so that we have pockets of successes that would actually not question but call the government to order. And that can also be a way of beginning to change this discussion on quality of governance we have in Africa. And in a nutshell, for me, we should hold our leaders. You know, an honorable member talked about the set of leaders we have today, and I like Winnie's. In fact, Winnie is always, well, so this is a moderate position today that whilst we say they are not doing well, we have to work with them and through them to change the system. There's so much to be done, but most importantly, let's prioritize jobs for African youth. Thank you.
And so a counter question to that would be, the jobs that are to be created are not necessarily in the industries that provide growth. And so what is your response to that?
You know, jobs, if we look at, it's me, the question is for me, right?
Yeah.
So if you look at agriculture creates or generates about 60% of our revenue as a continent. If we look at agriculture also helps to create employment. And if we create jobs through agriculture, it's actually a job that helps to move the continent forward. Mm-hmm. It addresses the issue of food security. And, you know, how can you even talk of development when you can't feed yourself? That is a basic point.
And how can you talk about not feeding yourself when we don't address the issues of the weather patterns?
No. You know, so when you talk of climate control, again, it's a whole range of conversation issues. It touches all of us, but in different proportions. And there are so many ways we can address our own challenges. Mm-hmm. But if I were an African leader, the conversation I would bring to the table would be different. The conversation I would bring to the table would be totally different. I would bring conversation to the table, because you see, we need to be careful here. In Africa, to a large extent, the way we generate electricity, and we generate it for some time, could, in a way, run contrary to some of these conversations going on today. Yet, access to electricity remains very, very important for us as a continent. There can't be true development of Africa in the 21st century without fixing access to electricity. Even the education we're talking about, healthcare delivery, security issues. Power is at the center stage of unlocking the economic potential of Africa. And so for me, anything that would take away from me as my agenda as a political leader, I will look at it again and see how we can negotiate with the rest of the world. And say, okay, we'll move in this direction, but these are our constraints. Can you help us here? I mean, we know how long it took some countries of the world, China and India, to come in, because they also have their own priorities. Africa, we should have our own priorities and take it to the table.
Lindiwe, you look like you're dying to respond.
So I agree with Mamweni, and I agree with Tony that the leaders that we have today are not exempt from accountability simply because we're dissatisfied with the ways in which they have implemented leadership in many instances, economic, social, etc. But I have a sneaky suspicion that there's a broad consensus in this room and at this meeting on a number of the policy matters that we are going to be talking about over the next 2 days. Be it the fourth industrial revolution, the climate challenge, extremism, terrorism, civic unrest. And I have also got a sneaky suspicion that we'll be back next year having the same conversations, because implementation won't have taken place in the intervening 12 months. And we'll even have a little panel about the dangers of not letting the rubber hit the road or something like that. But what we won't do while we're having those conversations is hold the drivers of those cars whose road rubbers don't hit the road in the first place accountable here and say that perhaps they're the wrong people for the job. So I think there's a broad consensus amongst a lot of policymakers, leaders on the continent. There's no shortage of knowledge and understanding of what the challenges that we face are and of the many ways that we can solve them. Some of them are frontier challenges, like the questions around the fourth industrial revolution that WEF will challenge ably, I'm sure, for the next 3 days. But what we are not talking enough about is why we keep coming back every year to talk about how all the knowledge that we have and the understanding that that we came to the year before didn't result in implementation on a grand scale over the intervening 12 or 24 or 36 months. And I'm not talking about instant change. Of course, development takes time, and this is why we have planning mechanisms in governments around the continent. But the truth of the matter is, despite the fact that we know many of the solutions to the challenges that we face, many of the solutions, we don't talk enough about and agonize enough over the fact that the people we are putting in charge of making these things happen are not delivering, and therefore they are the wrong people for the job. And it may sound, because I'm technically still a young person, like I'm advocating just for young leadership, but I'm actually not. I'm talking about a different kind of understanding of what leadership in an African society, an African country is, beyond politics and business, into the non-profit sector, into civil society, into churches, schools, communities, etc. We need to redefine leadership and redefine how we cultivate leaders, inculcate leadership, and how we think about leadership in our societies if we're going to get these high-minded goals and high-minded policy interventions implemented on target in the way that they should be, instead of coming back year after year to talk about how we face challenges in implementation.
Wonderfully put. Before we go to Winnie, I'm just going to go to Rich first.
I want to build on your comment. I think that the power of strong leadership and the ability to make a difference is enormous. And if I want to just step away from the continent for 1 second, this is my 5th continent in 15 days, so I'm sort of on a world tour right now. And a few weeks ago, I had the opportunity to be in India and have a chance to see Prime Minister Modi. And if I look at India, and I've been going there for many years now, and if I compare versus 4 or 5 years ago how people were feeling about the opportunities and sort of the sense of India being stuck in many ways and not being able to move forward. And I listen to many people that we speak to and the progress that's been made on many fronts through a very bold reform agenda on multiple levels, as well as an investment in things like sanitation and education. You wouldn't say that the problems are solved in India. The problems in India are enormous. They will take decades. But I do think there's a renewed sense that leadership can bring. I think that forums like this still play a very important role to highlight the ideas and practices and examples that can hopefully inspire people, inspire the leaders of today who are going to be here and listen to some of these sessions, and inspire the amazing young people and others across the business and government communities to get ideas, to sometimes challenge the status quo, to sometimes pick up the ball themselves and try to run with it and push things forward. And I think that it's a high bar to say that forums like this are going to be able to directly take on, leadership assessments. That's not what I feel like we're here to do, though I'm not minimizing that societally that those conversations should happen. But I do think that the more we can point to paths, whether it's in education or in agriculture or in entrepreneurialism and spurring the next generation of workers, that is an important element. And the last thing I'll just say, and again, I don't want to sound overly optimistic, and you're on the ground so much more, and you're so much closer to the real experiences that people are having. But we do a measure on sustainable economic development, where we try to get away from just measures of wealth growth to all the other measures: education, health, environment, good governance. And there has been a lot of progress on the continent on those kinds of measures. Forget GDP measures over the last decade. On the health side, in our last round of looking at it, 19 of the top 20 improving countries in the world were in Africa. Does that say health in Africa is where it should be? I'm not saying that at all. There's huge gaps. There's a long way to go. But there has been some progress made. So then the challenge in front of all of us is, what can we do to contribute to go to the next level, to take it even further?
Winnie, yes, 1 minute, please.
Well, we've focused very much on political leadership. We didn't talk about other kinds of leadership, because business leadership is very important too on the continent. And I think underlying all that is values-driven leadership.
Sure.
It's the values. And here, I have to say that we are in a very difficult context. Last year, I went to Honduras to visit a family. This family, a woman, a leader of an indigenous community, had been killed. And why? Because she had led her community to challenge the building of a dam that was taking away their livelihoods, and that had been actually licensed illegally. 3 human rights defenders are killed every week in communities around the world. So we have a leadership, both business and political leadership, that's not values-driven, that doesn't value human rights, that doesn't value people, so community, environment. And we have to build those values in both political and business leadership, in leadership everywhere. So I'm not optimistic because I'm involved in struggles against big business, taking away people's land, taking away people's water, depressing wages, paying low prices for commodities. I'm in struggles with politicians who, instead of listening and empathizing, suppress, silence voices. So, and a collusion between business and politics to the exclusion of the majority. So I'm not happy with the situation. There may be some signs of progress in some areas, but when you look at the situation of people in Africa, we don't have any reason to sit comfortably and praise ourselves. We should challenge ourselves more.
Thank you. So, pessimistic view over here. I just want to wrap it up with 1 point from each of you. We have less than a minute to go. I want to ask you, what are the short-term things that can be implemented by our leaders that you would like to see implemented on the continent that can be done in the next 6 months, let's just say, to create the conditions of responsible and reactive leadership that is value-driven? If there's one thing that you think can be done today, implemented, that the leaders that are sitting here can walk away with, what would it be? Quick and easy.
I would say that our leaders should begin to embrace legacy. Think about legacy in leadership. To me, this is all-embracing. If you realize that you will not be in this earth forever, on this earth forever, you realize that the office you occupy, you will not be there forever. 2, 3, you're concerned about how history, posterity, would judge you and your name. I believe strongly that it will go a long way in shaping how leaders deal with issues. The truth is, our leaders know what should be done. But either due to selfish interests, not either, it must be, they fail to do what is right. Some leaders are short-term in orientation and do not think of how they will remember beyond today. So if leaders embrace legacy and they guide them, they will help to fix Africa. But we do need political leadership to a large extent in fixing Africa of today.
Lindiwe, your quick point?
I would build on legacy and add mentorship and say that leaders need to take people with them in their organizations, in their communities, but specifically, leadership it doesn't spring fully formed from nowhere. It has to be nurtured, it has to be supported, it has to be resourced, it has to be monitored. And that requires those people in the room, people in governments and in civil society and in business who have leadership authority and who have the power to do so, to bring the next cohort of leaders with them, to nurture them, not to gatekeep them out of opportunities to grow and to step into roles that'll give them a chance to take over when the incumbents can no longer continue. And so I would say we should embrace both the legacy and the mentoring the next generation of leaders in a way that is generous and open and isn't selfish and hoarding of the opportunity to implement change in Africa.
Thank you for that. Rich?
I completely agree with the legacy points. I just would say, for me, the ticking clock on education is relentless. It's a couple million kids a year that you lose every time you let a year go by. So if you put a 6-month, infrastructure takes longer, other things take longer. I would just put a huge near-term focus on how to take the best practices that we know in education. It doesn't require massive amounts of new infrastructure. It requires a commitment to learn and share and adopt change that I think is fundamental to shaping the opportunities for millions of young people.
And I mean, it doesn't need to be completed in 6 months, but just start.
I think you start with, in this continent, with all the challenges, I'd start with education.
Okay, education?
Okay. For me, it's about increasing accountability of our political leaders to
And how do we do that immediately?
I have a practical proposal. And this is focusing on jobs for young people, just to have a scorecard. If just each of these African presidents could be counting how many jobs are they creating every month, just give us a record so that at least there's an accountability to young people that they are creating jobs. A scorecard.
I like that. I just want to thank our panelists for this lively discussion. I hope we have some interesting takeaways that we will think about throughout the forum as we go into other sessions and as we go back into our countries. I'm just going to ask all of you to remain for a moment, and I'm going to call up a renowned filmmaker, Anat Singh, to come and say a few words as a tribute to a fallen hero, not really fallen, but he's on his way. Please come up and say a few words about the recently passed Ahmed Kathrada. Thank you.
Hi. It's indeed an honor and a privilege to be here to pay tribute to a selfless leader, Ahmed Kathrada. He committed his life to improve the lives of our people during apartheid, and many of the topics and the suggestions that came out of this discussion and this panel were items that were very close to Kathy. And, legacy, young people, and he passed on about a month ago, and he lived through a very disruptive time under apartheid, and was always resolute in the fact that they would be free, and we as South Africans would be free. And after spending 26 years in prison with Nelson Mandela, he didn't want to become a politician. He didn't want to become a big deal. He just wanted to do what he could for the less fortunate people, not only in South Africa, in Palestine, and many other countries in the world. So he was never afraid to speak out, and I think we've seen, not only in our country, the public speaking out, but all over the world. You push your people to a certain point, and they have to speak out. And he was an inspiration and a role model to all of us. Lindy, you mentioned young people, and I think I've got a little video tribute that you'll see now, and he his organization, the Kathrada Foundation, focused on young people and their leadership qualities. So on behalf of Barbara Hogan, his wife, the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation and his family, I thank the forum for the opportunity to pay tribute to him. This is very special that we are coming together from all parts of the continent and the world to do this. As a filmmaker, I've put together this little film and of our African leader who we can all be proud of and celebrate his life. Thank you.
In 1929, Ahmed Kathrada was born into an Indian family in Schweitzer-Reneke, where apartheid was the law of the land. At a young age, Kathy joined the struggle for liberation. Risking his freedom for the rights for all South Africans, he ultimately faced the death penalty alongside Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu.
Well, I started distributing leaflets at the age of about 11 or 12.
He grew up in the movement. In fact, you can see from the fact that not a single of the big trials is Kathy not involved.
1946, 1950, 1952, 1956 treason trial, you name it, every national trial Kathy has been involved.
At the back entrance to the Pretoria court, large crowds gather to watch the accused being driven away to start their life sentences.
We arrived there early in the morning, very cold. I was the youngest of the 7, at 34. Everything was cold. Your cells were cold, your food was cold. The warder's attitude was, if not hostile, cold. You know, it was just cold all around. The weather was cold. I stayed in the cell for 17.5 years. If you stood here and looked out, not only can you see Cape Town, which is quite a distance, but the warders going to the harbor with their kids. That was the advantage of the cell. The main deprivation was children. You miss children. Mr. Mandela saw his 2 little girls when they were 2 and 3. Right. The next time he saw them was when they were over 16. A prisoner never loses hope. Never, ever. Although we were sentenced to life imprisonment, and for political prisoners, life meant life.
I was waiting for him. And I had waited long, and we met again. It was a moving experience, and became very clear that nowhere in the world the human spirit can be destroyed by a tyrant or an oppressor. He had emerged unscathed, ready to serve his people.
Six months later, Nelson Mandela was also a free man. They negotiated an end to apartheid and set to work building a new nation. Prisoner Mandela became President Mandela. With Kathrada as his advisor, they chose a path of truth and reconciliation over revenge.
He has been a great instrument of the movement. That is what he has brought. Confidence in the future.
A great fountain of wisdom.
He is a selfless person. He's made an enormous contribution.
You know, he connects to the issues that affect us as ordinary human beings.
Ahmed Kathrada remained core part of the leadership of our struggle at the time.
Old comrades worked with young leaders to make their highest ideals the law of the land. Kathy taught people in South Africa and around the world about the history, triumphs and lessons of the journey to freedom. He is a vigilant champion of ethical standards and of racial equality.
Freedom to be achieved has to be fought for, has to be sacrificed. There has to be sacrifices. Freedom you don't get on a platter. Nobody has given freedom on a platter to anybody. It has to be fought for. South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white.
They were very brave.
We are deeply grateful that today we live in a lively democracy.
But he's so warm and he's so humble.
You'd expect someone of his stature to actually be proud and, he'd want to be praised, but that is not who he is.
He's basically teaching us about non-racialism.
It's an incredibly good heart in Kathy that I think most people recognize and respond to. And, that is a privilege to live with someone with such a good heart.
Sunshine when he's gone. It's not warm when he's away. Ain't no sunshine when he's gone, and he's always gone too long. Anytime he goes away, I wonder this time where he's gone. Wonder how long he's gonna stay. Ain't no sunshine when he's gone, and this house just ain't no home. Anytime he goes away.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Anat Singh. Thank you for that tribute, that beautiful tribute. Thank you very much. And with that, ladies and gentlemen, go forth and be inspired by one of the lives of the continent's greatest heroes. Thank you very much, and goodbye.